Michelle, and I'm part of the University Events sub-team. I'd like to welcome you all to AFBE Real Project, Can Smart Cities Be Inclusive Too?, with our brilliant guest speaker, Ellie Cosgrave, an Associate Professor of Urban Innovation at UCL. So what we'll have is a 45-minute lecture by Ellie, followed by a question and answer session. If you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we will try to get to them at the end of the session. So just a little bit of an introduction to AFBE UK. So we are an organisation that helps support people from ethnic minority backgrounds and disadvantaged backgrounds, all the way from university students to mid-level and top-level professionals, from mid-level to top-level professionals. We do host a range of events, including transition and as well as real projects, which is what you're attending here today. So thank you all for joining us today, and I'll just hand over to Ellie.
I unmuted before I spoke, so I think that deserves a point already. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here. This has been a real opportunity and a real challenge for me in terms of putting together two topics that I'm really passionate about. And one thing I have learned from doing my teaching online this year is that I cannot multitask. So I'm going to focus on sharing screen, bring my slides up, and then start talking properly. I think that's one of the smoother transitions that I've done. So this is the kind of main proposition that I will be working with today and speaking to you about. And for me, these speak to two parts of my history and development as an engineer and an academic. This slide here attempts to tell you a bit of a story about who I am. On the left-hand side, we have Arup. I am a civil engineer by training, and I did my PhD sponsored by Arup in 2009 to 2013, I think. And what I was really interested in there was the policy implication of the smart city. What Arup understood then was that there was this thing of interest around urban technology and the future of cities, and that they wanted to have something to be able to say and consult on with respect to that. And over since my postdoc, I currently work at UCL, a lot of my work and research has focused on what is the role of IT, digital transformation, in creating the sustainable, socially just cities that we want to live in. Is there a place for digital transformation in urban policy, and how should that work? Kind of separately to all of that work, I have been developing a series. I mean, my kind of personal interest and personal work has been around gender justice, inclusive engineering practice, as well as I helped set up Science Girl in 2013. As I was writing up my PhD, a bit of a tip for people: if you don't want to focus in your whole life on your thesis, why not set up an organization at the same time? But here we were really interested in how can we create a more inclusive engineering workplace. And I currently run a project called the My Body Back project, which gives cervical screening and maternity care to women who've experienced sexual violence. So that right-hand side of the slide there is to say that a lot of my work has been around gender justice. And over the past 2 or 3 or 4 years, I have been consciously bringing that into my urban policy and urban design thinking, with a particular view as to how can we translate some of the knowledge held within particularly intersectional feminist theory into questions around infrastructure and infrastructure design. And so that is what I'm going to be trying to bring together today in this talk, if I can move the slide along. So I'm going to try to answer some of these, answer is a strong word, address some of these points. Firstly, I would like to present some understanding of the smart city, what the smart city is. Secondly, so that's the kind of left-hand side of this slide. Secondly, I'd like to present some kind of understanding of what an inclusive city is. And then towards the end of the lecture, start to interrogate whether or not these two things are complementary or contradictory, or perhaps it's secret answer number 3, which either you can tell me or perhaps I can allude to at the end. Sound good? I can't see any of you, so I'm going to assume you are nodding with great enthusiasm. Okay, warning. This lecture, I'm attempting to be coherent, but it really is an amalgamation of maybe 3 lectures that I have. And so some of them have been aimed at my students. Some of them are more active. Some of the talks have been a kind of more activist, trying to work with policymakers to understand notions of inclusivity in the city. And so there's going to be a lot. I'm going to chuck a lot of things out there into the Zoom room. And so I ask you to not try and deeply understand everything I'm trying to say, or don't put extra work into trying to make it all make sense. It is a Tuesday evening, and this is supposed to be a kind of empowering and interesting talk. So I'd like you to take what you want and inspires you, and things that don't make sense or feel uninteresting, that's fine. We're not going to have a test at the end. Secondly, I'd like to say that I am not the knowledge holder here. I know that you all have expertise, both in experiences of exclusion or exclusion. Exclusion? Oh yeah, inclusion or exclusion, oppression or domination. I know that you all have knowledge of the city, and I know you all have kind of knowledge of infrastructure production in some sense, or potentially better, like engineering productions. So this is a conversation. This is intended to be a dialogue. I don't hold the whole truth about this. These are some I will offer you some interpretations and some of my experience and some of the things that I've been thinking about related to this topic. So I would ask you, as I'm speaking, even as you're not speaking yet until we get to the Q&A, enter into a dialogue with me, be in conversation with me, even if you're not already speaking. What strikes you as important about what I'm saying? What does this mean to you? Where is your power? And what do you disagree with me? If you can actively do that as I talk, then we are well on our way to a really interesting and an exciting Q&A session, but hopefully that then you can create meaning for you and bring it forward into your own career. So Ellie, stop talking. That's a long introduction. Let's get going on question number 1, understanding the smart city. Now, you might imagine that a talk on a smart city, especially the part of the talk that says understanding the smart city, would start with a definition of the smart city. But I'm not going to do that, and I hope for reasons that will become evident. What I'm going to do instead is do a bit of charting the history of the term the smart city, so that we can understand the complexities and dynamics that ended us up talking about the smart city and it becoming a predominant mode of urban development in the 21st century. So we're going to do a bit of trying to understand the city by understanding its history and its life cycle. So in order to do that, I think we need to go back to 2008 or 2009. In theory, we need to go back a lot further than that into the 90s, but why not just like start somewhere, because we don't have all evening. So the important thing that happened in 2008, 2009, many of you may remember, was that IBM launched its Smarter Planet campaign. And this was largely a positioning and marketing piece from IBM to put itself on the map as a company that is important or central to the future of human prosperity on this planet, and that it was positioning itself as an organization that could understand human dynamics, complexity, the way we function, and would help us as a planet to make better decisions. And that wasn't just about cities. They had campaigns looking at biodiversity, at what's happening in the seas, what's happening in global warming. So it was in IBM's interest as a technology company to position technology as a kind of saving force in the world. And they did a really good job of it. Partly, and we know that partly because the word smart has stuck. And really before 2009, people weren't really naming it smart. But we have the legacy of that word today. And it wasn't just IBM doing that. There was the Siemens, the Cisco's, HP had and still has a lot of work on a kind of connected environment and sensors. Oracle, if you remember, was doing a lot of work around smart city solutions and teamed up with IBM. Oh, not sure, can't remember now, but they maybe, yeah, it was IBM, yeah. And they were actually it was, we can see how much it was important for these technology companies to be part of urban development and urban processes, because they were really building a market. They were giving cities grants in the order of millions in order to create demonstrator projects that would show the value of sensing the urban environment, having control rooms and operating sensors for the cities. And so we can see that evidently it's in technology companies' interest to say that technology will save or will help us, or will be the central mode of development in the 21st century that will help us contend with the most complex urban issues of climate change and managing the city in that context. But it wasn't just the technology companies who saw value in this. For example, many banks were interested in having a view on the smart city, partly because they saw the value in smart payment systems, and they saw the value of payment and tracking systems within their own business. And many companies actually started to understand their role since the early 2000s, how they have a role in urban development and creating our future. And many organizations have become urban brands, or they have a view on smart city on city strategy. What's the next slide? Okay, so from a public policy perspective, there were multiple responses from urban leaders about what the smart city meant to them. So we've heard the kind of technology push side, but really there was a lot of appetite within government as well to start doing smart city solutions. So one of the modes of engagement with the smart city from public policy perspective was this notion of, I'm going to use the smart city to put us on the map. We'll show the world we're at the cutting edge. And so these were really cities who were using the vision of the smart city to say, we're the place to be in the future. We are the place you should create a lot of inward investment to. Move your city here, move your business here, come and live here. These are the Songdos and the Mazdas, where really demonstrators of these kind of high cutting edge technologies. But this isn't the only story of the smart city. Many policymakers saw very different rationales for investing in the smart cities. Some of them really understood or bought into the idea that actually this is a case of urban development. This is, in order to stay modern and ethical, I need to see how innovative technologies are part of the solution to help me deal with the toughest challenges of my city. The idea was that if you didn't look at the role of information, the role of digital services, you were in some way not fulfilling your mandate or your responsibilities as an urban leader to do urban development well. Other cities understood that this was a kind of economic question, that smart technologies opening and supporting startups or innovative communities is what will create vibrant and creative and dynamic local economies. That this is a form of a new form of democracy where you could really get in touch with your citizens and your citizens' point of view, and that citizens can start to have a voice much more in a much more granular way than they have before. Nearly at the end of this, but another kind of response was, wow, this seems to be the word of the moment. Everyone seems to think it's important, but that stuff that Mazda and Songdo are doing seems expensive and complicated, and I don't know what it means for my city. So what started to happen was that smaller cities would commission consultants or organizations, other organizations, or maybe themselves set up boards to understand what actually, what should the smart city mean to them. So they didn't necessarily have a strong view. They weren't the leader like somewhere like Boston might have been, or Barcelona, who were really pushing for smart cities and trying to work out what it meant. They were really like, okay, let's sort it out. That was probably the most common response, but it did mean that there was a lot of investment in consultants to understand, what does this thing called the smart city do for me? And then there was this is actually linked to that middle point very much, was there the approach that I'm just going to open up government data and create opportunities for SMEs in my city to create innovative solutions and potentially do some good and interesting stuff. Certainly London and New York took this approach of, here's some data, what can you do best? This is kind of open data stores, open data competitions. So that's really the government response. Okay, and so at this point, it's not just technology push, but we're really starting to see governments sort of get on board and understand that they would like to, or they have an opportunity to do something quite special around technology development in their city. And at that point, you get consulting organizations like, PwC, Arup, Deloitte, and Accenture really starting to, I put Arup in there because that's where I was. I'm not pretending that Arup has as much consulting power as the Accentures, Deloittes, and PwCs of this world. But the point is that there became a market opportunity to say something as a consulting organization about how technology is transforming the world, what the smart city means, and what you should do about it, so that they can act as an intermediary between the large technology firms and the public organizations who need to justify decision making. But it wasn't just the, so we've got the technology push, we've got the interest in government, we've got consulting firms really starting to build up a narrative around the smart city. But then we also had universities taking this idea really seriously. MIT, Imperial College have had lots of programs investigating what is the creative potential of big data, new tech innovations. And even NYU set up its own center, and actually since then there's been there's been so many urban informatics, urban laboratory style universities who are really exploring and playing in terms of in creating the city as a lab and looking at informatics and information processing for experimentation. So here we can see the story of all of these dynamics and purposes of the smart city. And I think at this point we can say the smart city has arrived. This is where where the smart city is in a public lexicon, even if that's relatively niche, but it's arrived on the scene as an important concept in 21st century urban development, contested or otherwise. problematic or otherwise. It's arrived. But what I haven't mentioned is the parallel to this process was a huge success of firms that started as startups in the kind of early 2010s and saw great success of pushing their products, which were entirely transformative about the way cities work. From the types of things that we've talked about, that I've spoken about up until now, we can see that they're interesting, but maybe you don't see the real transformation on the ground. And these companies that I'm talking about are these friends who, of course, we all have heard about. But these companies, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the City Mappers, the Deliveroos, and I use Apple there as a signifier for technology companies who are making really good phones that enable all of the kind of visions of the smart city to play out, because they are the interface between the information systems of the city and our personal experience as users, you might say, of the city. Problematic language, talking of citizens as users, but that is wrapped up in smart urban development issues. So we have the Ubers, who are transforming mobility in cities. They're transforming taxi firms access to mobility. They're changing what are the ethics around work. Obviously, these organisations brought in the gig economy, but starting to really challenge some of the entrenched social dynamics of the city, again, for better and for worse, in terms of workers' rights, in terms of safety of urban environments. A lot of these are quite problematic technologies. But what was happening is that they had the crack team of investment in fantastic lawyers, where cities around the world were just not ready around this time to have a really strong view on, how do I want this technology to work? How do I want to regulate this? Often cities didn't have the regulatory authority to be able to regulate it in their own city, often relied on national laws. And so we have these organizations entering and transforming cities without a kind of city authority being really ready to understand what is the impact on my citizens, what is the impact on my pollution and particulates, what's the impact on the right to work, what's the impact on inclusive mobility. These kinds of questions were not deeply thought through when having the kind of legal battles with Uber. And Uber and all of these firms had really good, not only lawyers, but marketing strategies with citizens to be able to position themselves well to roll out in cities across the world. So I hope the purpose of me telling that story is really to avoid the question, what is a smart city? Because I think this telling the history and birth and evolution of the smart city as a business proposition, as a proposition of a better future from urban policy perspective, tells a much deeper and richer story about what we're contending with. And so I would say, please do not worry about definitions. If there are so many papers that talk about, well, what is a smart city? My answer to that, what is a smart city, is that it is what I think the social scientists call a floating signifier, meaning that it points to a set of attributes which kind of may be different for different places, that may change over time, that there is no one agreed definition of. The smart city may have been positioned as a vision or a thing that we want to achieve, an end goal, but a more useful and nuanced understanding of the smart city is that there are many ways it can play out. There are many ways that it will be experienced by different people. And there are many ways that it can be created. Importantly, that it's not an end goal that we achieve and then suddenly everything is solved, which I think is a problem. Anyway, so we can say that the smart city is a floating signifier for anything that relates to cities and big data, cities and tech innovation and experiments, or cities as modern infrastructure management approach. Maybe you think that's a weaselly way of getting out of having to define it, but I think it's an important nuance, and perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A. Checking the time. Okay. So a little pause there. That's the end of question 1. And now I'm moving into quite a different lecture style, so we're just going to have a little pause. Let's understand what we mean by the inclusive city. The way that I want to do this, and the way that I have been doing this over the past month or so in relation to the Sarah Everard murder, I've been asked to speak on inclusive and gender just cities a lot, particularly to built environment professionals. And the way that I think it is useful to think about the inclusive city is, again, not to define what it will look like or what it will be, rather to empower those who have a say or a stake in the development of urban contexts, to explain to them some of the key feminist theories that we might choose to apply to the built environment. And when I talk about feminist theory, I'm talking about key concepts of inclusion. I have an expansive view of what feminism is, and we'll get to that through this talk. So, the first theory is the idea of public versus private. When Sarah Everard was murdered, a lot of Cressida Dick, who's the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, was quick to reassure the public that whilst horrific, the events, this type of attack on women was incredibly rare. What that said to me was that the Metropolitan Police had a fundamental misunderstanding of the root cause of women's fear in public space. Women are not scared of public space because they are aware of the crime statistics in any given area. Women are afraid of public space largely because they know and have experienced violence in their lives, whether that is in the home, in their personal relationships, in their workplaces, or in the street. They know the vulnerability to be victimized or to experience male violence against them. And so we understand as women our vulnerability to male violence. So when women are shouted at in the street or experience harassment in the street, it's not just simply dehumanizing and objectifying in itself. It shows us that simply by presenting as a woman in public space makes us vulnerable to male violence. And this is a pervasive and everyday experience. But it is also a private experience. We have experienced that in our private lives. And this shows us that we cannot separate access to public space and experience of public space from our own experience in our home and personal lives. So this means that if we are going to tackle inclusive public spaces, we have to do that in a context of understanding holistically the experiences of women and other minoritized groups in the public, in a holistic understanding of their experience. This means that if we do not create safe public spaces, women will be confined, women and other minoritized groups will be confined to the home where most violence happens. Similarly, if we do not address private experiences of violence, women will have nowhere safe to go in public space. There are also not very many laws to protect women's safety in public space. So this calls us to not solely rely on physical interventions, but understand them in a context of a broader social context and experience. I would argue that we also have to break down some of our understanding of what professionalism means. What kinds of issues are deemed professional to talk about within a urban design process? We are all human beings who've experienced violence in one form or another. What would it mean to bring those personal experiences into design processes and design meetings? Is that considered too unprofessional? Do we need to reconsider what notions of professionalism are and stop that kind of binary? Theory number 2, intersectionality. Intersectionality is a theory that says we have many categories of identity, and that because of structural inequalities, systemic structural inequalities, some of those categories of identity are more catered to than others. Here is a very small list of categories of identity that will affect how we are treated and how we experience public space. So this affects both our needs of public space and our realities. Clearly, if we are a homeless person, we have very different needs of public space than if we have secure housing. If we have neurodiversity, for example, dementia, autism, we will have different needs and experiences of public spaces. The list continues. Intersectionality says that if we are going to, it often relies on an image of a bird cage. Here is a bird cage. To say that if I am only oppressed in one way, for example, if I am a cisgendered white woman with secure housing, a high quality education, no neurodiversity, and thin, then that is going to be a hugely, then I'm probably going to be okay in the world, and probably if only one of my categories of identity causes oppression, is uncatered for or excluded, then I'll probably survive it. It won't seem like a big deal. When we look back at these, if I am a gay trans woman who's homeless and black and fat and have a physical disability, that is going to be, I'm going to have a hugely different experience of the city and different needs. And so if anyone ever says to you, how can we design a city that is better for women or better for black people or better for young people, you say, which black people or which women? Because you cannot possibly, because looking at this diagram, you can see that it would be entirely impossible to design a city that is safe for all women. So we need to get more specific, and we need to get more comfortable in having these conversations. 10 minutes left. See where we go. Okay, so equality and equity is our next theory of feminist theory that we can cover quite quickly. I imagine many of you will have seen this diagram before. So this is trying to be euphemistic of how we might intervene in public space and the different resources that might be required to bring people with these different needs to the same level or experience in the city. So equality says give the same resources to everybody. And this assumption that's inherent in that is that everyone benefits from the same supports. This is equal treatment. Equity is a more progressive way of thinking about that, which distributes resource to people who are most in need so that they can have a similar experience. A justice-based approach would be to take away the hurdle that was there in the first place. Something is that approach to urban development is a bit more radical and difficult to conceptualize what that would actually mean. So I think equity is a really good starting point for us to be able to think about how we distribute our attention and resources in urban development, and how we justify that it does that particular action for a smaller group of society may be the most appropriate course of action, even if it doesn't improve the quality of the city for everybody. One way in which we can do that is by thinking about different methods. So this is a diagram that tries to explain equity in budgeting. So this is an example of where if you modeled what the needs are and costs are, you would be able to justify spending more money on disability access, even if it doesn't support the well-being of many people. So this is a kind of econometric, technology-driven way of understanding where and how we can invest. Oh gosh, I think I'm going to have to skip this, even though it is very important. Okay, can I do this really fast? I'm going to do this really fast. So again, this might be something you can take or leave. You may have heard feminists banging on about the binary, and I'm going to explain how this works. So the theory goes like this. Patriarchy structures the world through binaries, i.e. there is such a thing called men and there is such a thing called women, and they are distinct and different and opposite. There is something called logic and reason, and that is distinct from feelings and desire, and they are set in opposition. There's technology versus nature, science versus art, productivity versus care. What patriarchy then does is code them either masculine or feminine, and positions the masculine as superior and allowed to exert power over the feminine. Men are allowed to exert power over women. Logic is more important than feelings. Technology is more important than nature. Science is more important than art, and productivity, importantly, is more important than care. We can get into this in the Q&A. Yeah, skip over that. Okay, so what does that mean for the city? What it means is that women who are coded feminine are excluded from the realm of science, technology, logic, and productivity. And actually, I missed an important point here, that the masculine becomes the realm of men and the feminine becomes the realm of women, which means that women, as you can see, would be excluded from the realm of men, technology, science, and productivity. Okay, so that means that women coded feminine are excluded from the realm of science, technology, logic, and productivity, and therefore from professions where they may gain financial capital, the highest paid jobs, and therefore power in smart urban development. Ding, 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 we've come back to the smart city. Women are not often in positions of power when deciding about what gets done in terms of urban development. But it also means that the needs and realities of women. Hey, Ellie, you said you shouldn't just talk about women. That's not very intersectional. Agreed. But they're excluded from the needs and realities are excluded from smart urban development. Another corollary of what I was just talking about the binary was that social and environmental challenges of the city are set up as technological problems that can be solved. This means that resources that are channeled into global environmental crises focus on technological solutionism rather than reassessing patterns of consumption or building communities of resilience. They focus on, let's stay the same and solve it via technology, rather than how do we as a community need to readapt and care for one another as we move into this uncertain future. And it also means that where efforts to foster community exist, They are often, because they are seen as the kind of lower form of development, under-resourced and seen as peripheral to the kind of broader story of urban development. So we have this idea of the cities that we want. This is outlined in the New Urban Agenda. We say that we want cities that are just and free for all, and that everyone can experience a kind of true version of themselves via the city. But infrastructure and urban design approaches are often quite different to that. We see images like this which are don't necessarily meet that. But it's not only that these are different, that these kind of images of the cities that we want don't really look the same or don't really follow the same rationale. It's that because I believe that actually they're both useful, right? We're both useful ways of thinking about the city. So I'm not against smart city technologies. Obviously, I dedicated a lot of my life to it. But the problem becomes when, due to the kind of binary or patriarchal way of thinking, that we think that the smart kind of dehumanized systems are more important or more interesting or more true or better than the kind of softer rights-based, justice-based, community-based approaches. Please disagree with me. Okay, we have 3 minutes. So we come back to our first proposition. Can smart cities be inclusive cities too? Let's try and bring these two realms together. Okay, so let's talk about some nice stories about the smart city. We can see how these types of technologies can look at intersectional issues of inclusion, that they can understand how different people experience a city differently, and cater to those needs very much more specifically. So, this is a conversation article, truly smart homes and smarter cities could help dementia patients live more independently by tracking their movements if they go out of safe zones and get lost, so we can find them more easily, by helping them in their everyday lives to make decisions and manage their daily lives in a way that really meets their needs. Great idea. Another nice story, efficient public management. We have the technology to understand what the real needs are of the city, to censor and understand what are the levels of air pollution. This gives us more information, more granular information to make more targeted responses. You may have heard of Street Bump, which was trialed by the city of Boston, and nurtured by the city of Boston, which was a simple app on the phone, which people would put as they are driving around the city streets, and it's automatically report any kind of jaggedy movements to signify where there were potholes in the street. So it wouldn't rely on actual reporting, just kind of these roving human sensors moving around the city who had their smartphone. It would be able to create a public management approach that really was efficient and effective. There is also a deep human creative potential in smart technologies that allow us to engage through augmented reality much better with the kind of physical infrastructure of the city. This is a project by the Playable City, where it was a kind of artistic intervention where there'd be a spotlight supposedly from a street light on the floor, and it would record the shadows of people walking past and play it back to them after they have walked through it. We've seen how Pokemon Go and other kind of augmented reality gaming has enlivened the city and created a new dimension of experience in the city. Another nice story, so many nice stories about the smart city. We can also see how it has enabled participatory governments. This is governance. This is Paris. Madam Mayor, I have an idea, which was a kind of crowdsource idea for urban innovations in the city, which would use some of the city budget to invest in the ideas presented. They would be upvoted or downvoted by Paris citizens to say, what do you want to invest in? So these are both citizens' solutions and citizen have a say in what gets funded. Your budget, what do you want to spend it on? It also helps us get better data and advocate for more specific solutions. So if we know who is cycling, this is an example of a study in where was it? San Francisco was exploring the use of gender disaggregated data of who cycles when, so that it found that 29% of people cycling were women, and that is a helpful piece of information that's actually quite that enables a policy response that is more could create more infrastructure that is more suitable to the needs and realities of women. They also looked at race and disability dimensions, but the point is, if we can collect better data, we may be able to understand the dynamics of a city better and therefore make better decisions. Some concerns: surveillance. We know, especially from an intersectional perspective, that the more we surveil does not mean the safer that we feel. Surveillance is a huge part of a smart city development, even if that's not, if we don't see that as cameras. That a huge part is data collection about people's movement and experience in the city. And so, of course, it brings up concerns around who gets to use that data and what does it mean for different groups, and specifically groups that are often marginalized in the city. More, we saw in response to the Sarah Everard case, more CCTV was touted as a solution, but of course that for many groups, more CCTV feels more like an attack than a support. I said you might be able to get better data through smart city technologies. Caveat: lots of data doesn't necessarily mean that I make better decisions. So you have to be really careful about making sure that we don't just invest in things that we can measure. That we don't ostracize areas or over police areas, for example, when we know that we have a lot of crime data in a particular area. Does that mean that that is where all the police should be, and therefore often victimizing and criminalizing less severe activities that maybe would be happening in nicer neighborhoods? Nicer neighborhoods is the wrong word, more elite or gentrified areas. We can see from the kind of power of the smart city rhetoric that international firms might be dictating the experience and the trajectory of urban development. That is a concern. We can discuss that. And solutionism. Do I have a picture for this? No. I ran out of steam at the end of this, clearly. But this is really what I was talking about before, in that in the binary, where if we set up the city as a problem to be solved, a technological problem to be solved, which you could argue the smart city is, then we will only focus on technological rather than social responses. So a good smart city or an inclusive smart city, it brings us back to the initial proposition and the initial question: can smart cities be inclusive cities too? Well, my answer is, of course, secret answer number 3, which is that A, it depends what you mean by a smart city. B, it depends what you mean by an inclusive city. And yes and no. There are, as with urban development, there are always tensions, trade-offs, contestations and complexities that we need to integrate and work through. Okay, I nearly did it in time. Hopefully I didn't overrun too much, and let us maybe go into questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ellie. That was such an insightful talk, and I'm sure we've all taken a lot from it as well. So what I'll do now is I'll open up the floor to questions. So please feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat. And also you can unmute yourself and just give us a shout, or you can also raise your hand. So I'll just give everyone just a couple of moments well, I had a couple of questions myself actually, so I think I'll get the ball rolling. So I actually did some background research on this topic prior to this session, just so that I wasn't just being thrown in the deep end. And one of the common themes that I kind of read about was that smart cities were being based on improving areas that already worked. For example, moving over from 4G to 5G, automated bin collection, traffic control, but they didn't really facilitate behavioural changes in the users, as you said, or the citizens of that city, citizens that would need more support, the homeless, the disabled, those without access to internet. And you also mentioned prior to that, that sometimes the most logical conclusions or the most logical fixes may not work. For example, areas of high crime rates, if you add more policing to the area, what it would do, it would just reinforce, that bias, and ultimately it will cause more harm in the long run, as opposed to just, giving that quick fix. So as an engineer, I'm all about implementation. How would you say would be the best way to go towards actually improving services that are doing well, but also bridging that gap between the people that technically, they still matter as much as everyone else, the people that are on the borders of the city that politicians may not think about or look at, the marginalized community?
Such an important point, thank you. And it's reminding me when I was, I can't remember what year it was, maybe 2015, 2016, something like that. I was shipped off quite literally to India for a day trip, people. What are we doing? To talk to the government there about their 100 Smart Cities programme. So I was seen as like the British expert in smart cities, which was just so problematic and embarrassing in so many ways. Partly because I was talking about like these fun projects that you can do, the kind of playable city style stuff, or like, anyway, lots of different kind of nuances. And the people in the audience who were policymakers for local cities were saying, we don't have sewerage. So great that you want to do kind of lots of great things, but how do we make sure that we invest in the basic infrastructure and the basic services? And I think I don't really have an answer. I'd be interested to other people in the call, because I don't think the answer is, well, India, stay, just focus on putting like physical pipes in the ground, and don't focus on like edge, exciting tech innovations, because obviously India is a great place for that kind of work. But it was a very strategic campaign from national government in the 100 Smart Cities programme, which kind of said, we'll give you funding we'll give Indian cities funding, 100 Indian cities funding to do kind of smart city programming and processes. So I understand why kind of that's an interesting dynamic that I didn't touch upon, was because it's not just about cities trying to put themselves on the map or look like interesting places for inward investment. It's also, they often don't have legislative power to make a lot of decisions about how the city works and city functions, but a lot of national governments will have urban strategies and national urban plans to put the country on the map.
Yeah.
And so you have these kind of tensions between like really hyper local needs and the more macroeconomic intentions and diplomacy requirements of a nation state. So these kind of, that just like adds another layer of complexity, why everyone was kind of was and is interested in smart, because it sounds really like you're smart, right? Maybe something else I didn't mention. But if we take our definition of the smart city back to this like floating signifier, then, well, what is the use of big data in the context of my social goals and social responsibilities to the city, so that we don't divorce the tech stuff from the social stuff? So, but that requires us to have some training in social dynamics and social theory as engineers,
Yeah.
which sometimes just feels like way off and none of our business.
Yes.
So I've come to it from a personal journey of needing to understand feminism, because I felt like I needed to understand my own experience. And I have been able as an academic to bring that into my practice and my research work. And now wanting to work with engineers to start to understand how can we bring in some of those ideas so that our job is not providing technological solutions to well-defined problems, but much more becomes around understanding needs and finding appropriate interventions, which may be both social policy and infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. There's quite a lot of moving parts, and as you said, not just technological problems, but there's also that social problems that we can use our engineering brains, to fix as well. And it is our duty per se as engineers, to always have that in mind.
Yeah.
Thank you for that answer, Ellie.
I think that leads on to another point. I don't know if there's questions.
There's a couple of questions in the chat.
Let's get those questions and then I can.
Okay. So Ollie asked, have you looked at this primarily through a gender lens? Have you found similar data gaps and needs for ethnicity?
Yes, is the short answer. I have predominantly, my work in the last 3 years has been looking at gender dynamics. However, as I have said, in doing that work, I have found it impossible to not include the other categories of identity. And because I cannot, because when you say women, the implication is white women. Not, I mean, white women who have a job, and so that is exclusionary and very uncomfortable. And so when I was one project that I was working on, the client asked, I asked the client which women, and they replied, well, it has to be all women. And that is where I've had to deepen my pushback on clients who are asking for that kind of question, and to say, because at that time it shocked me, and I didn't know how to do it, because you can't do it for all women unless you lay out. So that helped me describe intersectional feminism in the context of the kind of work that I do. But I haven't, but for me, it has in the past always come with a gender starting point. A project that I'm working on now is for the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we're looking at what could we do to make urban transport more inclusive from a gender perspective. And so we're focusing, but we decided very early on that we needed to narrow that down, because that really doesn't mean anything. And so we've chosen to focus on female identified domestic workers, where they leave from and where they go to, and 3 cities, one London, Karachi and Cape Town, simply because that's where we were all from, and that where we have research power. So there was no kind of theory as to why those cities would be interesting, but they are interesting comparators. And what we're trying to do with that is to understand how much can be generalized about women's experience, or about how to make public spaces better for women, and how much cannot be generalized. Because so often you say, well, that works in London, but it would never work in Pakistan. And I think that's quite a sweeping statement, because the system is the same, because we still say, because there is still a root of women can be objectified, women are there for certain things, even if it may be as not as predominant in some contexts as others, or as socially acceptable in some contexts as others, still exists. So it may be that the solutions may look quite similar. Don't know. We're exploring that right now. We may find that we are very wrong and that they're totally different issues and social dynamics, and that means that the solutions cannot be similar. But let's find out.
Thanks. So I've got another comment and question here from Jess. That was really interesting, thank you. It seems as though people will need a smartphone to get the most from a smart city. Do you think this would adversely affect people who have less money or the ability to keep the phone working or charged, etc.?
Yes, very important point, which I certainly should have raised, especially in a kind of inclusive city. So of course, access to digital technology relies on all sorts of things, from a kind of educational ability to access finance to be able to run a smartphone. And even the smart city services are sometimes, oh no, I've got a virus threat, close. Are dictated by sort of elite urban users. So something like an Uber is not something that is going to be accessible to, for example, the domestic workers that I am studying, for want of a better word, working with to understand their experience. And so, of course, like, digital inclusion is a huge dimension of it. However, you could also say that in the part of the smart cities that is less about direct citizen services, the Ubers and the city mappers and the smart bike schemes or whatever, this part that is about efficiency of public services, making sure that we know where the water leaks are, or that we can do good electric vehicles, which will affect the number of particulates in the air. Those kind of like more base level infrastructure stuff is stuff that we should be investing in for everyone. So we can't just say, well, let's not do the smart city because it's only so many viruses coming in. Sorry. Oh my gosh. It's all being moved to quarantine, don't worry. Apparently. So I think that's a really great point. Thank you. I think that was Jess.
So the next question is Ollie. Really interesting merging of philosophy with engineering, which is historically where a lot of scientific findings began. Do you think there is a need for our curriculum to include more of this in order to produce more responsible engineers?
I feel like that's a leading question, Ollie. I feel like you maybe think it is. I hope, short answer is yes, and that has been a lot of my work has been around how can we introduce these ideas to engineering students. But I don't think we can stop there, because yes, students are sort of the next generation in many ways, and will and hold the lessons of university throughout their careers. I think that's really important. But if they're entering a career that says, oh, babes, doesn't matter, or no, that's not part of what we do, then that's going to be gradually eaten out of them, and it's not going to be part of progression. And so if we don't value it as ongoing development, and that understanding that engineering is political, even if we don't think we're engaging in politics or social dynamics, when we build stuff and we make stuff happen in the world, it changes the world in a certain way, and that's going to be political. So you can say, and my frustration in the early days of kind of climate action conversations, I say early days, my early days of climate action conversations, where are the engineers here? Where are the engineers at climate conferences? Because the politicians are saying the engineers will do it.
Yeah.
Well, and that just perpetuates this solutionism thing. Like, engineers have a part to play and should be at the table and should be hearing about all of the other social dynamics, social and political dynamics that are going on. You don't just go to conferences to influence, you kind of there to be influenced as well. So my frustration had been, and it is changing, not quite fast enough, where engineering firms are still the ones like first one ready with the kind of the terrible political infrastructure scheme that has been created. And what if engineers had a view on justice and infrastructure and how that could work differently? Because at the moment we don't push back, because we're always, as the engineering sector, really supported by government.
Yes.
Because we're the sector that is first invested in after crisis. And so there's not a huge amount of interest in saying it should be different.
Definitely. I mean, I'm quite hopeful for the new generation. So I do quite a lot of work with STEM outreach with kids ranging from 8 to, let's say, 16, 17. And there's this like Generation Z, as I like to call it, shift in mentality, where you'd ask a child, what would you want to be when you're older? And their answer is, I want to help save the planet, or I want to help this person, I want to help that person. You know, kids from a young age are now more interested in actually in climate change, in the environment, in, you know, making that world a happier place. And I definitely feel as if the curriculum also needs to change to reflect this as well. It's not just about going into work and getting a paycheck anymore. People want to have a feeling that they're part of something that will help, you know, future generations, etc. So definitely.
And that's kind of my approach to curriculum development. I teach masters, so it's very different. It's not like an expansive curriculum that sets the tone for a career. Well, it does for some people, but not for a profession. Is to say, and what I introduced at the beginning of this session is that I don't know. I'm not the knowledge holder, so challenge me and have a conversation. And that kind of, what if we got children to set their curriculum in a very considered way? Obviously, there's things you don't know. So, but what that would be so incredibly powerful to set up a life. To set up a kind of, I'm responsible for what I know. This doesn't happen. Knowledge doesn't happen to me. It's not done to me. It's something that I create and drive, and my curiosity leads me into those places. So I do think we need to consider the possibility that the way that we've done it for 100 years is not the perfect way.
Definitely. So moving on to the next question. In the realm of urban policy, do you find that cities or local governments are less willing to look at smart cities from an inclusive lens too? Is there a reluctance to look at solving issues from a social lens?
Whoa, good question. I don't know if it's a reluctance to look at it from a social lens, because I think policymakers are really aware that they're the custodians of social value, to put it in a sort of academic-y way, but they are their job and their mandate is to look after people. And I think a lot of people get into policy because they want to make the world a better place. And so I wouldn't say that there is a resistance to introducing social understandings to urban development process. However, what there is a resistance to is what one might call sort of wishy-washy ideas, and a drive towards where's the data? And often that's a really helpful provocation, in that, like, well, how can I know that there, like, I know the theory and I know the social structures. How can I measure this in a way that really holds my ideas to account? And so I think that can be a really challenging provocation. Like, okay, there are gender dynamics in cycling infrastructure, or how the needs and realities of single mothers and getting to doing all the things that single mother needs to do in terms of getting children to school, getting to work, getting to care, other responsibilities that precludes them potentially using a bike. We know that from theory. In a given local area, how powerful it is to really know the gender dynamics, or race dynamics, or disability dynamics of mobility in a particular area, and can you measure it? And then do really targeted solutions based on that. I think that's an interesting and helpful provocation. However, can be incredibly frustrating that things that you know to be true are either delayed because there is this kind of unnecessary pushback, because you could just spend 100 grand and put a thing in and sort it out. So it's a delay, or it's a kind of, I don't really believe you, because you don't have a certain type of data, or you can't measure this in a certain way, therefore it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist. And so the kind of, and it goes back to what I was talking about the binary of types of knowledge. It were a series of interviews with, I don't know, a Bangladeshi community about their experience of existing in a part of the city, might be trumped by some fancy models that show like a growth of one type of community, you know, that like would show something that would seem more solid or scientific than, I feel, uncomfortable. I would prefer a ramp, you know, that so there's this kind of privileging and prioritizing of types of knowledge, which, as I said, sometimes can be a good challenge and sometimes can be diversionary and frustrating.
This actually feeds in quite well to the next question from Blessing. Is there work being done for women in rural communities because of equity of services? Is this a challenge?
There are certainly different dynamics at play with in terms of gender in the kind of city and in and urban environments. For example, in cities, public transport infrastructure is often a lot better, which means that at night, for example, women are maybe out on the streets in a different way that they might be in a private vehicle in a more rural environment, a kind of self-contained urban vehicle, which means that the nature of the vulnerability is different. However, that also means that for poor people in rural communities, they might not have access at all to public space because there might not be a vehicle in the family, or there might be one vehicle which is used by the breadwinner and is therefore out of action for somebody at home with caring responsibilities, and therefore has to wait you know, an hour and a half for the one bus that takes them where they need to go. So yes, the dynamics and nature of people's experience in rural areas and characteristics of vulnerability are different. And there is work being done into that. that's not my area of expertise in terms of infrastructure development. So I'm not sure I can comment much more than I have.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Ellie. So Ollie has asked, have you looked at the impact of smart cities on employment? The smarter our cities and workplaces, the less reliant we are on low-skilled jobs, transactional activity. So this obviously has an impact on social mobility and justice.
Yeah, such a great point, Ollie. Want you to come and give part of this lecture, or all of you actually. Yes, so this is pointing to the idea that kind of manual labour and a lot of the kind of lower skilled jobs may well be taken over by mechanisation, and that is a kind of a story of urban development. When we go way back, this is not a kind of new fear that tech innovation transforms types of jobs and that are available, and especially for whom they are available. Industrial revolution, of course, meant that we had a lot of people working in highly dangerous, a lot of very poor people, very vulnerable people working in very dangerous places. We had the kind of upskilling, no, not upskilling, the upgrading of manufacturing processes when we looked at kind of cities that were built around car manufacturing and these kind of like great, in theory, great new jobs. We can see how organizations like Amazon, mind-blowing global organization that is absolutely transforming so many people's lives, that's not mechanized a lot of the jobs. It's actually created a lot of very poorly paid jobs and a lot of whole cities based, whole what we might call urban developments, even though they're not formally recognized as cities, but absolutely transforming people's lives in these kind of huge jobs. This is something that I have not studied and I don't really understand. So it's from watching documentaries about different types of manufacturing that I have started to gain an understanding of what it really means to work for some of these highly smart organizations. But of course, there is also the loss of jobs and the need to kind of reskill and retrain along maybe create more creative communities, creative roles. I think the larger point is urban development, smart or otherwise, has always required some level of industriousness or creativity from the poorest people to find work within this system. And that often means bad things. That often means that, you know, people come to city for opportunity, for work, for, you know, but often end up living in very large scale urban slums at the periphery of cities, trying to access that work. So it's a rambling answer because I don't really have one, but I appreciate the good point. That it is a complex nuance of urban development generally, including urban development based around new ways of understanding the city through technology and big data, will have multiple consequences on people's access to livelihoods, and that is the nature of cities and human development, and that we need to be aware of it and make sure that the poorest are not the most affected. But it's capitalism, babes. Like, that's the structure of capitalism as well. So this is where government, for me, has to be the one who regulates and redistributes.
Definitely. I feel, just like an alternative opinion, for example, the HS2 line that was supposed to run from London to Birmingham to connect two major cities. I mean, it would produce jobs in the short term for blue collar workers. However, in the long term, it would benefit white collar workers. For example, the people that would maintain these train tracks, that would operate them. You wouldn't necessarily have a train operator, you'd have someone sitting in an office somewhere, and they'll be the one that will be doing all the planning and the management. So it kind of highlights the changing skill set that the education system needs to, again, develop. You know, what about those kids that drop out of school when they're 16 or they're 18 or don't necessarily go to university? In 20 years' time, can they feed their kids, you know, with the way the job market's changing? So it definitely does highlight a lot of, I mean, how the social structure is changing a lot, actually.
Yeah. And, you know, to take your example of HS2 even further in terms of like, who does it benefit in the longer term? Yes, the white collar workers. And who does a train line from London to Birmingham serve in terms of economic development? Not the blue collar worker.
Nico saying I work on HS2 in the chat there.
Your perspective.
Yeah, but as Ollie said, it might also make a universal basic income a necessity. So just another way of where engineering overlaps in everything, and about how our future Prime Minister should definitely be an engineer. But that's just my personal opinion.
Who are you?
I'm Nikkei agreeing as well. Fantastic. If anyone wants to ask any further questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and join into the conversation. It's very relaxed, you know, anyone can feel free to drop your opinion.
I've seen lots of references to Caroline Criado Perez's book in here. Yes. And yes, that comes up in pretty much every talk that I do. I was interviewed by her for the book, and she had come to some of my workshops early days. So
I'll definitely write that on my to-read list once I finish my thesis.
There are lots. This is a great book that I think is so well written, talking about, well, it's claiming space in a man-made world, which I think is a very nice title.
Brilliant.
A very readable and very like a human story about urban development.
As she said, she's going to add it to her ever-growing Audible list, yeah. which you'll eventually get to one day.
I really need to cancel my subscription because I've just got so many things to be listening to. This is the problem of not having a commute anymore.
Oh yes, yeah.
The podcasts.
You haven't got the time to listen to everything. Guess there are some drawbacks to home working as well, yeah. Brilliant, fantastic. So I'm assuming that there's no more questions. So first of all, I'd really like to thank you, Ellie, for coming in today and giving us that talk. It was very, very enlightening, just being able to look at it from all angles, as everyone could argue. Sometimes that's literally what we need to do. Mm-hmm. Just take a step back and look at it from everyone's, you know, shoes, not just your own. And I'd also like to thank everyone here for attending our session. We at AFBE hope that you've learned a lot, because I know that I have. Just to let you know that we have another event run by AFBE Scotland, labelled Maths That Can Stop an Apocalypse, which sounds super interesting. So please do sign up. I will post the link in the chat in just a moment. There you go. I hope everyone is able to see that. And then also, just on another note, and as an organisation, we'd also like to commemorate that today is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. A moment that, you know, forced the world to have, albeit a difficult conversation surrounding race, diversity and inclusion. But that is kind of where we are today, and I'm glad that, you know, we are having these conversations. You can find our official post on our website as well. And if you can also look in the chat, and there's a link there to AFBE's call to action surrounding George Floyd's death last year. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.